Why can't Africa really keep the lights on? To get into it, let me tell you a story of my wedding. I was standing at the altar, waiting, and then Parker Bell's Canon in D starts playing. The doors open, and my bride walks in hand with her father. But halfway down the aisle, blackout. Moments later, a diesel generator rose to life, and the ceremony continues. Disruption has become a fond memory from that day, but that's not always the case for a majority of the population. Imagine a welder in the capital city. In a good month, he'll spend more on diesel than he pays himself in wages. Put together, these individual experiences start to paint the picture of Africa's electricity problem. And no, it's not about generation capacity. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone could, on paper, power almost half the continent. Yet tonight, a family in Kinshasa, Lusaka, or Johannesburg will be spending the night in candlelight. So this is the story of a system and a grid that has the power but is unable to deliver it to its desperate customer. So let's get into it. Let me give you some numbers to consider. According to the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, in 2023, 565 million people in sub-Saharan Africa had no access to electricity. That's far more than the entire population of the United States sitting in darkness on a continent with some of the largest untapped energy resources on Earth. And interestingly, a third of the world's power deficit was made up by Nigeria, Ethiopia, and the DRC, three economically critical countries making up almost 33.3%. But here's what I want to highlight. I looked at this data and initially assumed it was a generation problem. But by the late 2010s, several sub-Saharan African countries were generating more than their own grids had capacity for. Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Cameroon, and South Africa, to name a few, each had a surplus. And this paradox literally left me scratching my head. How can Eskom in South Africa or Zesco in Lusaka be sitting on a surplus when this video exists? I learned that having power and delivering it are two very different things. And Africa's grid has spent more on the first part while barely touching the second part. To understand why, we first need to look into the financial model. Let's first look at how the price of a kilowatt hour is structured in sub-Saharan Africa. Most power suppliers sell electricity for much less than it costs them to produce and deliver. The loss is usually absorbed by governments through subsidies or by the suppliers themselves. This directly leads to a system that can't afford to maintain its infrastructure, let alone develop modern facilities for their country's ever-evolving needs. Slowly, the transformers that have been left in service years past their lifespan degrade. And since maintenance funds can't keep up, the service is barely a patchwork. And eventually, the degradation compounds, with each new maintenance cycle becoming more and more expensive. Eventually, you reach unprecedented levels of cost cutting just to keep up. A common example is load shedding, a planned power cut to specific areas on a rota basis. It's an intentional choice designed mostly to prevent much worse structural failures. And the other is installation delays. For example, when my mother's building project reached near completion and she applied to have it connected to the national grid, she was placed on a year-long waiting list as the utility company only ordered material on demand from China at the time. This is why a country can have plenty of megawatts of electricity sitting in a power station and still deliver none of them to their customers. So let's dig into why the pricing is set this way. The first thing is political interest. Higher tariffs are politically unpopular. Electricity is one of those bills that a family will consistently see on their monthly budget. That makes it politically dangerous to raise the price and rewarding to suppress it. Closer to election times, subsidies increase to artificially lower the price of electricity, and the supply consistency suddenly improves. But anyway, this is the cycle. Low revenue means the utility company can't properly maintain or expand the grid to keep up with demand. Poor maintenance leads to outages. Outages lead to customers expecting to pay less, and the cycle repeats. But that's not the full story. Morocco and the Ivory Coast, to name a few, have found a solution. They have set up performance-based tariffs that for the most part remain outside of political influence. This cost-reflective model has allowed the Ivory Coast, for example, to achieve 80% electrification. It's not perfect and has had intermittent issues, but it's headed in the right direction. So why can't this be replicated across the continent? The easiest story to tell is the familiar one: corruption, state monopolies, and governments that just don't care. There might be truths in part of that, but it's not the full story. For decades now, countries have come together to build regional power pools meant to share resources and excess energy. This is in hopes to regionalize the energy market and allow countries to export excess electricity to neighbors that might need it. 5 of these power pools exist across the continent now. The most advanced one is the Southern African Power Pool, which was established in 1995. And on paper, this setup should have already solved a large part of the problem. A country like Zambia, sitting on a large hydroelectric potential, could export its excess energy to a neighbor that's running generators 24/7. But even in the Southern African Regional Power Pool, cross-border electricity trade only accounts for a small fraction of total regional demand. The system still fails to unify a proper financial model to maintain its infrastructure. So the union has power between it, but not the wires to move it. Building transmission infrastructure falls to state-owned utilities, which, as we have already established, are financially strained. Weak cost recovery problems mean the investment capacity to build those cross-border lines simply isn't there. Every country would genuinely benefit from an interconnected regional grid, but no single struggling utility company can afford to build its share of it alone. There's no one party to blame for that. There's only a structural gap that every country has an interest in filling but can't afford to. This is a financing and coordination problem, not corruption, operating at a continental scale. And it's the same basic framework that discourages private companies from entering the energy market in the first place. In the middle of all of this, Kenya has quietly built one of the most remarkable electrification stories anywhere in the world. In the early 2000s, only 15% of Kenyans had access to electricity. By 2024, that number grew to 75%. Part of that is geography. Kenya's geothermal generation is ranked first in Africa. The other part of it is a deliberate choice to stop waiting for the grid to arrive everywhere at once. Kenya also ranks as the world's biggest market for off-grid solar power systems. Companies selling pay-as-you-go solar kits financed through mobile money over months instead of years have effectively skipped the grid altogether. Kenya isn't necessarily solving the nationwide infrastructure problem, but actually circumventing it. The national grid still loses lots of its energy to technical failures, but it's proof that a country with no other advantage except the willingness to combine grid and off-grid solutions can rewrite these numbers within a decade. The Ivory Coast is a financial case study. Kenya is the structural model. A cost-reflective model helps a region generate electricity and maintain its infrastructure, but a decentralized system like Kenya's brings energy within reach of families who can't afford the cost of reviving a fundamentally broken grid. So a question still remains. Do governments advocate for local businesses and families to build independent power systems? Or does that risk neglecting the already failing grids? The answer depends entirely on each government's priorities. Private electricity systems don't pay monthly bills, so does that mean every customer that goes private is a loss of revenue? Maybe. Either way, the public is largely a passive participant in this high-stakes game of monopoly. Speaking of unwilling participation, did you know that Africa's food security was once caught in the crossfire in a regulatory war between the EU and the US? It's a really fascinating story. Come back for that one. Thanks for watching.